Imagine walking out of a store, keys in hand, ready to head home after a long day, only to find yourself face to face with flashing blue lights and an officer questioning whether the car you're standing next to is even yours. This is the reality Marcus, a hard-working man and proud father, faced on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. Marcus, an African-American man in his 30s, had just picked up a few groceries and was heading to his car, a car he'd worked tirelessly to afford. But before he could even unlock the door, a police officer approached him. The officer, stern but calm, asked Marcus to step away from the vehicle. Confused but cooperative, Marcus complied, assuming there must have been some sort of misunderstanding. What followed was a moment that would challenge trust, ignite emotions, and leave everyone, including the officer, questioning their assumptions. You see, Marcus knew without a shadow of a doubt that the car was his. It had been for years. But for some reason, his simple truth was about to be tested. The officer claimed the car matched the description of a stolen vehicle. Marcus provided his ID, registration, and proof of insurance, but the officer's skepticism didn't waver. And that's when things took a surprising turn. What the officer did next not only shocked Marcus, but also everyone who eventually heard the story. It was a moment that revealed something deeper about our society and the judgments we make. Was this a case of mistaken identity, bias, or something else entirely? And how would Marcus prove that the car was indeed his? Stick around as we dive into this incredible story, a moment filled with tension, truth, and an unexpected twist that will leave you questioning everything. Marcus stood by his car, his hands slightly trembling, not out of fear, but out of frustration. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on him, their judgment hanging in the air. It wasn't the first time he'd been in a situation like this, but that didn't make it any easier. He looked at the officer, who was now radioing in for more information, and tried to remain calm. Marcus had nothing to hide, yet he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that no matter what he said, it might not be enough. The officer, Officer Daniels, seemed professional yet distant, as though he was sizing Marcus up while waiting for confirmation about the vehicle. Marcus couldn't help but wonder why the officer didn't seem to believe him, even after showing all his documents. Had someone reported seeing a man like him acting suspicious? Or was this just an unfortunate coincidence? Marcus tried to explain again. He talked about how he bought the car 3 years ago, how he still remembered the day he drove it off the lot with pride. It wasn't the newest or the fanciest car, but it was his. He even mentioned how his daughter loved riding in the back seat, singing along to her favorite songs. But none of it seemed to make a difference. Officer Daniels simply nodded and kept writing notes. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't stop replaying the events in his head. Did someone call 911 and report his car stolen? Was this some kind of mistake in the police database? And why was this taking so long? The longer the officer waited, the more the situation escalated in Marcus's mind. He glanced around, noticing a small crowd forming nearby. Their whispers felt heavier than the silence between him and the officer. Then, without warning, the officer walked back to his patrol car. Marcus's heart raced. What was going to happen next? Would he finally be able to leave, or was this about to take a turn he couldn't see coming? The tension hung thick in the air, and Marcus could only wait. As Marcus waited, the seconds felt like hours. He stood there, watching Officer Daniels through the windshield of the patrol car. The officer seemed focused, his hands typing rapidly into the onboard computer. Every now and then, he glanced at Marcus, his expression unreadable. It was like a scene out of a movie, except Marcus wasn't acting. This was his life. Marcus's mind wandered to his daughter, Maya. She was waiting for him at her grandmother's house, probably asking when he'd be back. He hated being late, especially on the nights they planned to cook her favorite meal together. The thought of her smiling face gave him strength, but it also made him more determined to get this over with. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, his integrity and ownership of his own car being questioned in broad daylight. The small crowd that had gathered began to grow. Some people pulled out their phones, recording from a distance. Marcus tried to avoid their eyes, but he could feel their curiosity and judgment. Were they assuming the worst about him? Did they think he was guilty? His pulse quickened, but he focused on keeping his composure. Losing control wouldn't help his case. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was joined by another patrol car. A second officer stepped out, a younger man with a brisk walk and a clipboard in hand. The two spoke briefly before the younger officer approached Marcus, his tone slightly less formal but still guarded. "Sir, we're running your information, but we've got some discrepancies in the system," he said. "Can you confirm when and where you purchased the car?" Marcus repeated the story he'd already told, his frustration barely contained. He mentioned the dealership, the financing paperwork, and even described a sales manager who'd helped him. The younger officer nodded, but his expression didn't shift. It was clear they still weren't fully convinced. At this point, Marcus began to wonder if this was about more than the car. Was this a simple mistake? Or was there something deeper at play, something that neither officer was saying out loud? The tension kept building, leaving Marcus and everyone watching, desperate to know what would happen next. Marcus stood still, his heart pounding as the second officer retreated to the patrol car. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every movement the officers made felt deliberate, calculated, and heavy with meaning. The crowd nearby had grown even larger, their murmurs turning into a low buzz of speculation. Marcus tried not to focus on them, but their presence made him feel like he was on trial before an audience he didn't ask for. He glanced at his phone, debating whether to call someone, his mother, his brother, anyone who could offer some sense of reassurance. But what would he even say? That he was being accused of stealing the car he'd worked so hard to own. It all felt so surreal. Instead, he slid his phone back into his pocket and turned his attention back to the officers, who were now deep in conversation. Through the car window, Marcus could see Officer Daniels holding what looked like a printout, gesturing toward the younger officer. Their discussion seemed tense, almost as if they were debating something. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could feel the energy shifting. Were they starting to believe him, or were they finding more reasons to doubt his story? The uncertainty was unbearable. Then, Officer Daniels stepped out of the patrol car, the paper still in his hand. His expression was stern, and he approached Marcus with slow, deliberate steps. The crowd fell silent, their phones still recording, as though everyone knew something was about to happen. Marcus braced himself, every muscle in his body on edge. "Sir," Officer Daniels began, his tone firm but unreadable, "we've got some new information. It's about the car." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He didn't know whether to expect relief or more trouble. The officer's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, but he didn't continue right away. Instead, he glanced at the crowd, then back at Marcus, as if deciding how much to say. The pause was excruciating, and Marcus could feel every eye on him. What came next would change everything. Marcus held his breath as Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering between Marcus and the crowd. The officer's hesitation only deepened the sense of unease. Finally, he said, "The car you're driving, it's been flagged in connection to an ongoing investigation." His words hit like a freight train, leaving Marcus momentarily speechless. What investigation? He hadn't done anything wrong, and as far as he knew, his car had never been involved in anything suspicious. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "This is my car. I bought it, I have the papers. What kind of investigation?" Daniels glanced at his partner, who seemed equally tense, before responding. "We're still piecing things together, but there's a report from another state claiming this car's VIN matches one that was stolen last year." Marcus froze. A stolen car. It didn't make sense. He had bought it directly from a dealership, with all the proper paperwork. He even remembered the financing headache he'd gone through to make it happen. "That's impossible," he said firmly. "There's no way my car is stolen. I've had it for years." The officer's expression softened slightly, as though he could sense Marcus's sincerity, but he didn't back down. "Sometimes these things happen," he said. "Cars can be resold with fake paperwork, or VINs can be cloned. Until we figure this out, we have to treat it as a possible match." Marcus's mind raced. If what the officer was saying was true, then this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a nightmare. Was his car part of some larger scheme? And if so, how could he prove he wasn't involved? The officers seemed torn, as though they wanted to believe him but couldn't ignore the evidence piling up against him. Just then, a voice from the crowd broke through the tense silence. "Hey, that's Marcus. He wouldn't steal anything." Marcus turned to see a familiar face stepping forward. It was Kevin, a co-worker from his old job. Kevin's sudden appearance seemed like a lifeline, but it also brought a new layer of complexity. Would his support help or make things worse? The stakes had just risen, and Marcus knew the next moments would be critical. Marcus turned toward Kevin, his co-worker's voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Kevin walked closer, his hands raised slightly, signaling he didn't want to cause trouble. "Officer, I've known this man for years," Kevin said. "He's honest, works hard, and he's owned this car for as long as I can remember. There's no way he's involved in anything shady." The officers exchanged glances, Kevin's statement adding a new layer of doubt to the situation. Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, but new words alone wouldn't clear him. Officer Daniels turned back to Marcus. "We're trying to give you the benefit of the doubt here, but we need to verify everything. If the VIN issue checks out, you'll be free to go." Marcus nodded, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "Run whatever checks you need. I'm telling you, this car is mine." As Daniels returned to his patrol car, the younger officer stayed behind, seemingly more open to conversation. "Sometimes cars like this get caught up in larger schemes without the owners knowing," he said. "If that's the case here, we'll figure it out." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the officers worked. Finally, Daniels stepped out of the car, holding a different report. His expression was unreadable, but he walked toward Marcus with purpose. "Mr. James, the database just updated. Your car's VIN was indeed flagged, but it looks like there was a clerical error in the system. The stolen vehicle was recovered months ago, and the flag on your VIN should have been removed." Relief washed over Marcus, but it was short-lived as Daniels added, "However, there's one more thing. During our check, we noticed a recent alert tied to your license plate. It appears someone tried to clone your plate for illegal activity." Marcus was stunned. "Clone my plate? Why?" "We see this sometimes," Daniels explained. "Criminals duplicate plates from similar vehicles to avoid detection. You're not under suspicion, but we'd recommend replacing your plates to prevent further issues." The officers apologized, their tone softer now, and allowed Marcus to leave. As he drove away, the weight of the situation lifted slightly, but a nagging thought lingered. Somewhere, someone had tried to use his identity, his life, for something criminal. The realization left him both relieved and unsettled, knowing this chapter had closed, but another mystery had just begun. As Marcus drove away, the hum of his car felt different, like the tension from the past hour was finally unraveling. He glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the officers pack up and the small crowd start to disperse. For the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself to take a deep breath. The relief was real, but so was the lingering unease. The thought of someone cloning his license plate and dragging his name into something illegal made him realize just how vulnerable he could be, even while doing everything right. On the way home, Marcus stopped to call his mother. He didn't want her to worry, but he needed to hear her calming voice. As he explained what had happened, she sighed, her words a mix of sympathy and encouragement. "Life will throw these tests at you, Marcus," she said, "but you handled it with grace, and that's what matters." By the time he reached his daughter Maya, the weight of the day had begun to fade. She ran out to greet him, her small arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "You're late, Daddy," she said with a playful pout. Marcus smiled, scooping her up into his arms. "I know, sweetheart. It's been a long day, but I'm here now." Later that evening, as they cooked together, Marcus reflected on the experience. It was frustrating, unfair even, but it also reminded him of the importance of staying calm under pressure and standing firm in the truth. The officers had apologized, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it could have ended very differently. It was a stark reminder of the challenges he and others like him sometimes faced just living their everyday lives. As he tucked Maya into bed, he looked at her peaceful face and felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter what life threw at him, he would always fight to protect her and build a future she could be proud of. For now, though, the storm had passed, and all that mattered was being there for the ones he loved.